Um, I think Simon's term, fishing farmers and farming fishermen, is a very nice way of looking at the traditions and maritime cultures of the enslaved. And it's a great segue to our next session, which will be told by Jerry Augusto. This story explores how the enslaved produced their own food, creating provision grounds outside their domestic dwellings or on marginal lands as forms of resistance. Plants nurtured by the enslaved in bondage, in limbo, and in freedom are explored as epistemic objects and offer a window into their integrated knowledge of botanical, culinary, medicinal, agricultural, spiritual worlds, as well as green landscapes of their own making. So welcome, Jerry. I've done an introduction to you already, so I believe you're good to go. I think you're on mute, Jerry.
I shouldn't be on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I said I would go straight without more formalities into the first part, and then I'll be joined at the end by my colleague Elianise Sacramento, who will be coming to us from close to Salvador, Bahia in Brazil. Enslaved Africans and their descendants all across the Americas were in many ways dispossessed architects. Theirs is a collective, still incomplete story, one which unfolded up and down the plantation Americas, continental and island, leaving few, if any, individual names, but indelible traces. Under duress, the captors built and sometimes designed much of the valuable infrastructure which undergirded regimes of racial capitalism: roads, dams, barrages, irrigation works, ports, train stations, but also all types of works and buildings for manufacture, refining, milling, making, storage, commerce, and even worship. From this built environment, the enslaved drew no profit or succor, and only rarely the infinitesimal earnings accrued from being what we say in English hired out. In Brazil, they call them escravos de aluguel or escravas de ganho. Skilled wielders of stone and wood, copper and iron, thatch and tiles, mud and daub, they built not just the townhouses and plantation manors of the masters, but also their own, at best modest, and at worst cramped and insalubrious cabins, huts, and the collective barracks that they call senzalas in Brazil, on thousands of tobacco, indigo, sugar, cotton, rice, coffee, and cocoa plantations. And yet, around those small spaces of nightly confinement, intended for surveillance, control, and dehumanization, or in the interstices of the plantation and on more marginal lands some distance from it, enslaved women and men also managed to imagine, design, and create a green counter landscape architecture, yard gardens, and provision grounds or crosses. These pieces of cultivated land were a welcome supplement to the meager diet of starches and the occasional piece of salted meat or fish, which constituted often cruelly inadequate owner-provided rations. It did not take early plantation or fazenda, habitación, engenho owners in Brazil, the various colonial Guyanas, the Caribbean, and many of the southern states in the USA to see the profit-enhancing advantages to having the enslaved take on the additional burden of feeding themselves, wholly or in part. Early iterations of the onerous Black Codes, instituted first in Spanish and French, and later in British plantation societies, featured articles specifying by quantity and type the rations an owner should distribute to the captive laborers, as well as supposedly Christian prescriptions against their working on Sundays or religious holidays. But in actual practice, to a degree which varied depending on plantation size and export crop harvesting and refining seasons, many plantation owners in different parts of the Americas adopted what came to be known as, quote, the Brazil model, and flaunted outright the proscription against captives working 7 days a week. Instead, on tiny plots just outside their doors and on collectively or individually worked provision grounds, often situated on hard to access or difficult terrain, enslaved laborers were allowed to cultivate or raise a portion of their own food, vegetables, tubers, and fruits, especially, and also sometimes poultry and pigs. It was work for a second, or in the case of many enslaved women, a third shift, one which could only be done at night after a day spent laboring in field, kitchens, and workshops, or else on the days supposedly set aside for Christian worship and celebration. But this multifold exploitation quickly took on counter meanings for many of the enslaved. Plots became, in their eyes, a hard won, if precarious, customary right, zealously and repeatedly negotiated with plantation owners. Out of hillsides, swamps, and woodlands, or on the little patches which became important extensions of their own crude lodgings, enslaved gardeners and horticulturalists carefully tended and coaxed crops, sometimes abundant enough to sell the surplus in local markets or through vendors plying urban streets. These were practices which drew, despite the misery of enslavement, on the prominent role African women played in farming and marketing in West and West Central Africa before European contact and colonization, and still do. Selling a portion of their food crops, flowers, and herbs fetched cash, which the enslaved used to buy foodstuffs that they could not raise, additional or better quality clothing, jewelry, implements, and household items. But perhaps the most precious use of the proceeds of gardens and provision grounds was in garnering penny by penny, year by year, sufficient cash to buy one's freedom or that of a spouse, an elderly parent, or one's very own child. These dispossessed architects so valued the landscapes which they designed and put to their own purposes that they sometimes were compelled to go on strike or even to rebel outright to keep them or to take back time off to maintain them. One such story comes to us from the French colonial island of Martinique, where after slavery was finally legally ended, it was quickly restarted in other guises as coerced or barely remunerated labor on lands still retained by the former enslavers. Grasping former habitation owners set about confiscating not just the former case negre, the cabins of the enslaved, but also the adjacent yard gardens. For many now legally free Black Martinicans, this was a final unacceptable blow. It compounded rapacious sharecropping work contracts, public discrimination, and lack of access to schooling for their children, and so in 1870 they revolted. In that short lived uprising, Sophie Lumina, a young, pregnant Black seamstress who also assisted her parents with their own small plot and hired herself out for coffee harvests, became a formidable, incandescent leader. Neither she nor many thousands of other Black women would readily give up their gardens and plots, for they had become not just an indispensable part of sustaining self and family, but much more. These were the spaces where memories of field, flower, and food from Africa were reinterpreted under the harshest of circumstances. This was the environment, at once natural and human shaped, in which enslaved cultivators drew on knowledge of the natural world, farming practices, technical skills, aesthetic traditions, ecological practices, and religious beliefs of the diverse African societies from whence they came. Here also was where they put into practice local botanical knowledge learned from the indigenous people of the Americas and introduced some of the African legumes, tubers, and fruits which made the crossing over the Atlantic. Okra and sesame, watermelon and ground nuts, sorghum, yams of various types, black eyed peas and pigeon peas, among others. Botanical knowledge exchanges which took place first in the fields where Native Americans and Africans were early on enslaved together in the Americas. They continued later on in the areas to which some of the Africans and their descendants boldly fled to inhabit a freedom which allowed them to build new lives and cultures with complex and sometimes contested alternative models for self defense, self provision, and trade. Maroon settlements, in other parts of the Americas, quilombos, palenques, mocambos. Many of the plants formerly planted in bondage and the native plants of the indigenous people became, in the hands of maroon green architects, a liberation flora. While the gardening practices of the enslaved also included plants brought by European settlers to the Americas, their ideas about land use and gardening were not those of imperial botany and settler colonialism. The very forms the gardens took, cropping in layers, trees over bush, bush over ground plants, raised mounds for tubers, crooked instead of straight uniform rows, or no rows at all, multiple crops instead of monoculture, herbs alongside fruit trees, movable wooden or live fences, comprised a green counter landscape radically different from that of slave based plantations, which were actually factories in the field. That same green architecture also constituted a sacred, sometimes secret geography for spiritual practices such as honoring ancestors, confectioning food offerings for the African divinities, the Loas, the Orishas, the Nkisis, and celebrating births, as well as a counter landscape of care where natural medicines were cultivated. It's not hard to imagine that the green and purple and red of their gardens provided rare moments of solace, pleasure, pride, and one of few sources of beauty for enslaved women, especially. Indeed, more than a few of the freedom narratives, otherwise known as slave narratives, recorded in the US South attest to this. Indisputably, the gardens of the enslaved constituted, as historian Judith Carney has argued, Africa's botanical legacy to the Americas. That legacy engendered the internal food markets of the Caribbean, provided motifs for decorative arts, and gave rise to a delicious variety of cuisines and valuable plant-based pharmacopoeia in many American societies. It is a legacy sometimes hidden in plain sight. Our grandmothers' gardens, searched for and sometimes found, ephemeral but reproduced and reinterpreted century after century. What if we took seriously African American landscape architecture scholar Kofi Boone's invocation to quote, finally and fully grant the proposition that Black landscapes also matter? What would it mean to re-signify these gardens and grounds, such a critical part of domestic world making by the enslaved, as an alternative genealogy for landscape architecture and for environmental justice, spatialized manifestation of a hard-won, gendered, Afro-diasporic futurity purposefully inscribed on the land against all odds, all that she could implant. Thank you. We'll move now to a commentary and a compliment to what I have just shared by a young colleague of mine from Salvador de Bahia. Her name is Eleonise Sacramento. I hope we can bring her in now. Yes, Leo, we call her. Eleonise Sacramento is a scholar of Quilombola meaning maroon, Quilombola social history. Uh, she's an activist with fishermen and fisherwomen, the fishermen and fisherwomen's movement in Brazil. She's a resident of a fishing quilombo, and she continues to be a marisqueira, which is what the women who catch shellfish call themselves, of a particular community, the Quilombola community, the fishing maroon community of Conceição de Salinas, which lies in the Recôncavo region of Bahia, Brazil. So I'll give people a chance to adjust to the interpretation button, which is down at the bottom, where our colleague Marty Gapi will do the translation of Leo's presentation. I think also we might want to move to just the showing, yes. So, Leo?
Sim. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu quero contribuir nesse debate a partir da última fala da professora Geri, né? E que aponta para nós a possibilidade de ressignificação dos jardins ou das plantações, das matas, dos territórios, e apontando também que esses territórios importam. exemplo, né? E dialogando também com a apresentação que nos antecedeu, que antecedeu a professora Geri, por exemplo, no sentido de reafirmar que esse território dos povos e comunidades tradicionais são territórios de terra e de água. Não é um território só de terra ou só de água, né? E que essa complementariedade garante a potencialidade da nossa produção e a potencialidade de um modo de vida que se mantém nele, né? A professora Geri também já me apresentou e falou do lugar onde a gente faz a vida pulsar, né? Nós estamos aqui no Recôncavo Baiano e a colonização e o processo de escravização oficial foi perverso nesse território e deixou várias marcas, né? Marcas profundas de invisibilidade, sobretudo da luta das mulheres negras e dos homens negros, mas historicamente a gente tem feito luta e feito resistência em defesa do nosso modo de vida e da tradição, ressignificando, inclusive, esse modo de vida e essa tradição no diálogo com os povos indígenas, num território que a gente precisou aprender a viver nele e com ele, né? Nessa relação, a gente tem contrariado o que nos impõe as normas regulamentadoras, inclusive da pesca, né? Que tenta colocar para nós um tipo de profissional ou um tipo de povo que desenvolve uma única atividade, onde a monocultura se faz presente, e a gente tem reafirmado que nos territórios tradicionais, na pesca e na agricultura de subsistência, não existe monocultura, né? O que existe é uma grande diversidade e também uma riqueza de produção que acaba nos diferenciando do modelo de vida imposto pelo capital e nos grandes centros. E manter esse modo de vida tem sido extremamente desafiador, porque os grandes projetos que muitas vezes, como também já foi abordado inicialmente, desde o processo da escravização oficial, nós somos obrigados, nossos povos muitas vezes são obrigados a trabalhar, e a gente diz aqui no Brasil, cavando o buraco nas atividades de menor prestígio e de baixa remuneração, ao tempo que esse território ele é expropriado, né? Ele é fortemente expropriado. Mas estando nós na contramão do sistema, estando na contramão de um modelo de desenvolvimento que ele é exterminador de povos e de tradições, nós temos mantido vivo e viva esse conhecimento tradicional, que ele é um conhecimento ancestral também, né? E é passado a gerações. Especialmente em tempos de pandemia da Covid-19, em que não se tem uma medicação assim específica para tratamento desse vírus ou dessa doença, ter alimentação saudável, né? Ter território, ter folhas para chás, para banho, tem sido de grande importância no enfrentamento à pandemia da Covid-19, mas também no enfrentamento a outras enfermidades e outros problemas, né? Aí a gente tem revelado para a sociedade a importância da produção pesqueira, a importância dessa produção, que é uma produção que se faz e que se extrai das águas, também numa relação extremamente respeitosa com essas águas, que para nós não é só o lugar de trabalho, né? É o lugar de produção de alimento, mas também é o lugar de culto, de reprodução da vida, e que esse ambiente ele se mantém viável e sustentável porque a gente se percebe parte dessa natureza, né? Dessa natureza que ela não está distante de nós, e a gente tem estabelecido uma relação respeitosa com ela, tendo atenção aos tempos das marés, a determinação da lua, e para respeitar os tempos das marés, que algumas vezes é favorável para a captura dos pescados, outra vez não é favorável, a gente necessita ter articulado a essa produção das águas a produção que a gente chama de produção da terra, né? A produção nos quintais, na roça. Eu estou aqui numa roça de beira de praia, né? E que a gente tem autorização do órgão competente para fazer uso desse território, que é um território especulado para a construção de resort, de outros grandes projetos, né? Que não nos quer ver nos lugares que, historicamente, a gente tem defendido. Ficou muito evidente, assim, eu dialogo a partir da nossa experiência, que a nossa experiência está muito articulada com os elementos que a professora Geri traz, mas também que o professor trouxe anteriormente. Assim, nós, por exemplo, as mulheres pescadoras, em sua maioria na Baía de Todos os Santos e no Recôncavo, nós não sabemos nadar, né, contraditoriamente. Isso é muito é uma influência perversa do machismo e do patriarcado, né, também, né? E esse elemento ele precisa estar presente também nessa conversa. Mas, mesmo sem saber nadar, numa relação profunda com as águas e com a entidade das águas, que para nós Oxum nas águas doces e Iemanjá nas águas salgadas, muitas mulheres atravessaram no passado, né, a Baía de Todos os Santos e outras baías para realizar o serviço de ganho nas capitais e adquiriram as suas liberdades, porque não é uma única liberdade, né? Através desse serviço. E ainda hoje, na nossa luta cotidiana também pelo sustento, não só a luta política, mas a luta pelo sustento para garantir o alimento, nós atravessamos essas baías, né, para escoar a nossa produção nas feiras e em outras cidades, né? E pedindo licença, sempre pedindo licença às águas, porque a gente tem dito que, diferente do que diz a poesia, nós não queremos fazer a passagem para o outro mundo, para o mundo espiritual, para encontrar com a entidade das águas, né? O nosso encontro com essa entidade é um encontro diário. Como também a luta pela liberdade ou pelas liberdades é uma luta diária, uma luta constante que se faz nos territórios tradicionais. Porque esses territórios, esses espaços de beira de praia, de beira de rio, que antes não eram lugares cobiçados pela burguesia, a burguesia hoje tem trazido seus empreendimentos para esse lugar, né? E aí, para manter esses empreendimentos nesse lugar, tem sido importante nos invisibilizar, inviabilizar também o nosso modo de vida e a nossa tradição. Aí esse diálogo nesse espaço para a gente é extremamente importante, vou concluir, né? Acho que porque a gente tem entendido que conhecer da experiência dos povos nos diferentes países nos ajuda e nos fortalece na nossa resistência. Fazer alianças estratégicas também com esses espaços de outros de construção de conhecimento é importante porque as nossas vozes, que não são dadas porque nós já temos, elas são ampliadas, né, numa dimensão em que a gente possa fazer denúncias no sentido de promover justiças ambientais, justiças sociais, justiça territorial e justiça também de gênero. Que viva nós e que viva as águas. Me coloco aqui na continuidade desse diálogo.
Thanks very much for that, Leo. I'm going to do a very, very, very quick kind of summary of some of the high points. I think we had a bit of a technical problem, so I just want to make sure that everything that you said, which was very rich, is captured. I think one of the most important things that Leo's contribution points out is that there is not necessarily in Maroon communities, Quilombola communities, this division between those who live by the waters and those who live by the land, because they both fish and farm. The little video that was running in the background, which Leo was kind enough to take for us yesterday in her mother's garden, is out in the back of the family home. And it is a garden that Leo's mother inherited from her own grandmother, which takes us back to slavery times, because in Brazil, slavery only ended officially in 1988. And so she's walking us through on the video, which will be available on the virtual platform, the type of garden that her mother and that she continues to keep. They also keep a grossa, which is different from the garden in the backyard. The grossa is more akin to the Caribbean provision ground. So it may be at some distance, it's a larger expanse, and it's used for a different type of cultivation. But Leo was also tracing the connections between the presentation which preceded ours, Kevin and Simon, because of the many links between living by the water and living on the land in Brazil as enslaved people in the Recôncavo region, which is where she is, and also for the Quilombo or Maroon communities today. She also pointed out a very interesting fact that many of the women, and I've been there with them often, who swim and who fish cannot swim today, which doesn't mean that they could not swim yesterday, but she says that perhaps we need to also put in the question of the perversity of patriarchy in what African and African descendant women do or don't do today. But they make their living on the waters, the women, that the other community that she lives in, and they make their living on the land. One of the things from the film, the short video that Leo shared is the variety, the lack of monoculture, which she said is also the lack of monoculture in fishing. There are many types of fish and seafood. There's no one type. There are many types of plants, and she's walking us through the space where there are medicinal plants, there are fruit trees, there's okra, lots and lots of okra. At the end of the film, you see the food, the kind of food production. This is a film from yesterday. She also spoke about the tides and how important it was for these women who are both farmers and fishermen to be able to go back and forth on the tides. So they would go from the islands and traditional communities where they're located back over to Salvador on the shore, the main city. And it was the tides that would take them. I think this video is coming from her family home, so don't be surprised. You may see members of the family. So they would go back and forth on the tides. And she was explaining how for the enslaved women, they would go back and forth to hire themselves out, sometimes as help with farm labor, sometimes with selling their own products of their fishing. And that story that what I mentioned about people buying their own freedom from selling food produce in the market, is also the story for enslaved women in Bahia, including from this fishers community. They would, through selling fish, as well as through selling their food crops from their provision grounds, be able to buy their freedom. And she ended her presentation with a kind of an invocation that asks us, that thanks us for the possibility of an alliance with people who are studying slavery, but who are in other parts of the Americas and in the diaspora, but who also are interested in social justice and environmental justice, because these are very much also the heritage of the Maroon communities, the Maroon communities that still exist today in Brazil, in Jamaica, and other parts of Latin America, are also very important for us, linking together these things, the producing the green architecture on the land, producing a kind of aquatic architecture with the things that they did at the shore and on the ocean and by the rivers, and that these things are still quite relevant today. I'll stop there. It's a rapid summary that doesn't do full justice, but that's one of the beauties of the virtual platform that we're going to create. You'll be able to access the text, the photos, the videos, and everything from there. So I think now, if it's all right, Mae-ling, we can move into if there are questions. And I'll just go straight to the first one that I see here and read it. Marcelo Ferraro says, thank you for the presentation, Julie. I'd like to ask you a question. The classic book of Gilberto Freire, Casa Grande and Senzala, established the architecture of Brazilian plantations as a representation of Brazilian slavery. Scholars have long criticized the Freirean paradigm, but many studies of plantation architecture still focus on big houses as symbols of power, wealth, and distinguished taste. This is also reinforced by plantation tourism. Your research moves beyond by describing how Africans influenced the making of material and cultural landscapes. In parallel, there are important initiatives by Quilombola communities reinventing tourism and offering a critical perspective on the legacies of slavery. How does your research connect to this politics of tourism and historical memory? Thanks, Marcelo, who I should say is also a deep scholar of the history of East Brazilian, deep scholar of the history of slavery in Brazil. It's a very important question. One of the things that I think this project and other projects which are studying what happens in the wake of slavery, the legacy of slavery, is to revisit these paradigms that have grown up in, not just in anthropology and history, but have also grown up in fields like architecture. And as you mentioned, it's the plantation owner's prospect. It's the big house, the large garden, the Casa Grande, the townhouse, the town manor. And even the tourist industry that is kind of in the United States, there's tourism that grows up around places, that's grown up around places like Jefferson's plantation or Washington's plantation. At the most, the stories of the enslaved are kind of tacked on to that. In Brazil, I think that people are kind of trying to take a different path, and Leo could speak better to this than I can, but I'm not so sure with the interpretation difficulty if I'll be able to translate for her. Maybe I will try to see if I can translate for her so that she can also answer. But it is treated by the Quilombola communities as a question, not just of tourism and historical memory, although some of them are beginning to try to create that possibility of tourism. But for them, it is exactly what Leo pointed out in her presentation. It is about not some old history that's past, but about the struggle to retain, to obtain and retain the right to live on those lands, not just with African retentions or anything like that, because these are dynamic communities. They're not outside of some kind of old history retained from Africa or from plantation times. These are living communities today, whose modes of living are alternative, whose notions of an economy for today are alternative, who involve that kind of eschewing or avoiding monoculture, mono use of the waters. They're really offering a kind of an alternative model. So a visit to these quilombos today is not a tourist visit, or not a tourist visit alone. It is to begin a dialogue with alternative modes of thinking about nature, about the environment, about family economies, about development constructions, a whole host of things. So it's not so much memory and tourism in the kind of sense that we often think about it, but it is rememory and transforming in that kind of way. I hope that makes sense. Not sure what issue you are reinforcing the interpretation. Okay, I'm trying to read a message here that I can't read very well. So I'm gonna have to skip that message. Marcelo, allow me since that's the question that I see. I'm gonna go to the other question and then I'll come back and try to explain a little bit to Leo what you're saying, or maybe I should do that first. Leo, can you hear me? Leo, pode me ouvir? Está ouvindo?
Sim.
Ok. Há uma pergunta de professor, Marcelo Ferraro, que faz a pergunta sobre as iniciativas das comunidades quilombolas quanto a turismo e quanto à sua perspectiva crítica da herança de escravidão. E quis saber como que pesquisa, como aquela que você estava a fazer com a sua comunidade e a pesquisa que eu faço agora com jardins e roças, como que isso liga-se à memória histórica que vocês têm nos quilombos? Não sei se isso faz sentido. E se você quer responder, muito breve, eu vou tentar traduzir.
Então, difícil é o breve, né? Que eu sou baiana que fala cantando.
Então, espera, você vai falando e eu vou falar. Leo, I asked her to make a brief answer to Marcelo's question, but she said she's from Bahia. It's hard for them to be brief, but she's going to try. Go ahead. Continue.
Então, a experiência de turismo étnico tem sido pensada em algumas comunidades tradicionais, né?
There are some traditional communities or Quilombo Maroon communities that have been trying to rethink the whole question of tourism, sometimes called ethnic tourism.
Mas ainda é preciso avançarmos, visto que a ideia externa para as comunidades ela está muito pautada em torno de uma ideia romântica, né, ou estereotipada, ou a ideia de uma exploração dos corpos e dos recursos que estão nesses territórios, né?
So part of the problem of them trying to rethink what kind of tourism you would have to a Maroon community, a Quilombola community like hers, is that it's dominated still by a kind of external, outside view of who they are and what their history is. So it's a kind of view that can be very romantic about what the Maroon community is, or it can be very stereotypical about the Maroon community and its connections to slavery, or it can be very exploitative of the resources that are there and of the actual bodies of the people who live there. So this is part of the problem of them thinking about, for themselves, a politics of tourism connected to Maroons and the historical memory of slavery.
Então, a experiência da escravidão, ela é uma experiência extremamente dolorosa.
The experience of slavery for them is, of course, a very painful experience.
E a liderança indígena, Ailton Krenak, ela vai dizer que ninguém aprende com a dor, né? Que a dor não nos traz benefícios, mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente não pode negar essa experiência, né? E se não podemos negar, e se ao chegar nesse território, a gente encontrou estratégias em parceria com os povos indígenas para estabelecer alianças e manter ou reconstruir alguns conhecimentos, inclusive conhecimentos sobre as folhas, sobre o território, a gente tem aí um caminho de resistência que precisa ser valorizado.
Okay, I'm going to translate this very quickly and then I'll see if there's one other question and I think we'll have to end. But she was explaining that there is a saying that says nobody learns with pain. And slavery was historically a very painful experience for people, for indigenous people in Brazil and people who are in the maroon communities. So they're trying to pursue a strategy where you don't negate the pain, but that you also can work through it to do some other things. So one of the strategies that they have is in alliance with indigenous people who are, who may be living in the same area or are actually mixed Afro-Indigenous communities to try to bring forward the knowledge, precisely the kind of knowledge that we were speaking about, the knowledge of plants, the environmental knowledge, and to turn or shift the tourism and the kind of politics of tourism and historical memory to that knowledge that they built up over the years, over the centuries, and to what the value of their ways of thinking and living and that knowledge can do for today. I'm going to have to stop the answer because I don't want to take up a lot more time. Leo, eu vou nos trancar aqui por razões de tempo e vou só responder a mais outra pergunta. I think there was one more question, but here it was. Martina Odonkor asks, I'd love to know more about how the crops brought along by the enslaved were actually transported across the Middle Passage. Thank you, Martina. There's actually quite a bit of literature coming out these days about that very question. And one of the things that the virtual platform will have for each of our presentations and for everything that goes on the virtual platform, there will be an extensive bibliography. So you'll be able to go to the platform if you have that, if you're seeking that type of reference and find it. But in brief, I can say that in some cases, in many cases, these seeds kind of made the crossing in foods, the store of foods on the slave ships. So down in the hold, there might be the seeds of what to some people would appear like a weed, but to the Africans and Afro descendants, they knew that it was medicine. There is a mythology about how African rice got to the Carolinas, but the actual story is probably not the lady carried the rice grains in her hair on the slave ship, but rather that people like Thomas Jefferson and others who were very aware of the skills and the resources of the coast of the parts of Africa from which they got enslaved people. They knew who had skills in raising what, and rice is an example. So they knew to ask the captains of the ship, bring us seeds of this or that. Other foods crossed over because they brought maintenance, provisions for the enslaved in the holds of the ship to replant certain kinds of things there. And then some few were actually brought probably by enslaved people as seeds. People, slave owners also, plantation owners also, as part of the British Empire, would look everywhere in the British Empire for foods to bring. And they would bring some over from Africa and some from Polynesia, from the Pacific, from India, wherever. So these things came by various means across the seas to the Americas. I hope that answers the question, but there's a lot more material even in the platform as it's already set up. Each of those links that you saw would get you to some things that would help answer the questions. I see one more. No, it says 3 were answered. So Mae-ling, guide me here. I shall stop. Oh, questions in the chat. Oh dear. Oh my.
Maybe we should end with one last one, Jury.
Yeah, tell me. I can't see the questions.
Right.
That's a good thing to ask me, but I can't see it.
I'll read the one from Anthony.
Okay.
So really informative presentations and important shifting some of the ways we grapple with racial slavery and its afterlives. I would like to ask a question about memory and what work does that do in the making of freedom? Does liberation flora make us think differently about freedom?
Thanks, Anthony. I hope it does. I hope that there is an assemblage that's on the platform, and it's one that I created, and the title of it is Plants of Bondage / Liberation Flora. Actually, limbo plants, it also comes in the middle. I think that one of the important things for us to start trying to, or to continue to try to do, because other people are doing this work, is to think, what does it mean to inhabit freedom? Not just kind of the act of running away or the act of declaring a republic in the case of, say, a place like Haiti, but what does it mean for the formerly enslaved to inhabit the freedom and to make it theirs. I use the example of the plants because we were, by and large, Africans enslaved and the Afro descendants, put to work in rural areas on plantations growing crops. So our relationship at that time with the growing of crops as forced labor is a very, as Leo referred to it, a painful memory. But at the same time that that was going on, and this is the stage that I call limbo plants, there's people who are still enslaved, women especially, managed to make out of their dooryard gardens and their provision grounds a kind of no man's or no woman's land between being enslaved and being able to have some control over some very important part of your life. The liberation flora part to me in the assemblage, I'm trying to think visually about it, is what happens when you can get away altogether to create a different space. And that's what the quilombos are. That's what the maroon settlements are or were in the case where they aren't anymore. And that is where the same plants and even different additional plants become one of the means by which these people, now no longer enslaved, inhabit their freedom. And it also goes into the uses, the way that they constructed land ownership, etc., which is also why some attempts at freedom or liberty go backwards or escape that. Because if you go back to the plantation and the plantation regime, have you really inhabited a freedom? But in the case of the maroon communities, at least the ones that I know in Brazil, they are inhabiting a freedom, and it's a freedom that they still have to struggle, sometimes militarily, to keep. Long answer, complicated question. Thank you very much. Mae-ling, is there anything else that we need to do?
No, I believe we have had a fruitful and powerful discussion here. And thank you so much, Jerry and Leo. What an honor it is to have you with us, someone who actually lives in the Quilombo firsthand and tell us about their lives. So thank you very much, Leo. So we're going to take a break, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. We're going to take a break, an hour break for lunch. And then we'll come back to join Remaking a Home and Monumental Life, those two sessions. We know that the Zoom format is incredibly challenging to stay on for the whole day. So we will have another coffee break just for 15 minutes before we have a very open and informal group discussion about everything we've heard today and opportunities to work together. So have a good lunch. We'll come back in an hour at 1 p.m. EST. Thank you.